Hello and welcome. I'm Debbie Viadero. I'm one of the assistant managing editors here at Education Week. And we just wrapped up our online summit on what schools are doing to prepare students for the future work world. I hope you were able to sit in with us, but if not, we're going to talk a little bit here about what went on in our discussions and extend the talk a little bit more. I'm here with my colleagues from Education Week. On the far end is Mark Lieberman. He is one of the contributing writers, and he focuses on digital learning and technology in schools. And sitting next to him in the green is Stephen Sawchuk. Stephen is an associate editor here at Education Week, and he covers districts, school districts, district operations, and civics. And next to me is Sarah Schwartz. She's an associate editor here. No, assistant editor here at Education Week.
Sarah Sparks.
Sarah Sparks, I'm so sorry. And she is our research expert on staff. First of all, Sarah, you had an interesting booth on focusing on creativity. Can you talk a little bit about what schools and teachers can do to encourage creativity in classes and what you heard in the booth about that?
Yes, it's really interesting because there's research just in the last year that teachers often think they're doing a lot of creative practices in class. Last fall, Gallup had a survey in which more than half of teachers thought they were doing practices intended to boost creativity, things that have been found to be effective, like asking questions and problems that don't have any one particular answer, and situating assignments in real-world problems. But a third of their students actually agreed with them. So a lot of our discussion was around what teachers could do in the classroom. And it was across grade levels and across subjects. Some of the basics were creating an environment in which students felt safe, felt that it was okay to make mistakes and to try out really out there solutions to problems. And one teacher talked about encouraging students who seem to offer a solution that other kids might have a negative reaction to. So, for example, she asked her elementary class, how do we tell that air is real? And she was getting some call-out one-word answers like, we Google it, or science, and there was one little boy who said, we can't see it, it's not real. And other kids were kind of looking at him. She said, that's a real problem. How do we tell it's not real? I mean, how do we tell it's real if we can't see it? And that encouraged both the little boy to keep talking and her whole class to start thinking about the problem more deeply and coming up with creative ways to think about, okay, how do we tell if this is real? What are other ways we can test it? And that got them thinking creatively in a subject, science, that people might not be thinking about encouraging creativity in.
Mm-hmm. A little cognitive dissonance there for students. Stephen, in your booth, you were talking about efforts in upstate New York to embed career technical education right in local businesses. Right. How does a school district even get started thinking about doing something like that? What are the first steps?
That's a great question. And, largely I think this is one of the BOCES, which is sort of like a regional collaborative in New York. And so they're responsible for 23 districts. And they just started, they had a number of, they're sort of based out of the Syracuse area, and they had a number of businesses where they thought, it would be great if we could get our students embedded in these businesses, just because here at our own school sites, we don't have the money to keep up the equipment or technology that we would need to have it most cutting edge. So for example, I mean, I think a really classic example is like automotive services, where you're working on this old clunker of a car that's been sitting there and tinkered with for 20 years. Well, the cars of today, self-driving technology, backup cameras, it's just a totally different ballgame, right? But school districts don't have like, $40,000 to sit and buy some great new, you know what I mean? So I think pragmatically they looked at it and they said there's a huge sort of like it's the mall that was converted into like an auto shop / dealership, and they thought, they have every car in the world here, why don't we just figure out if we can work with them? And so what they did was they actually created sort of a classroom space at this business site, so that they could teach teach sort of the theoretical content-based underpinnings, and then have kids tinker and work with these mechanics the rest of the time. So I think it was broadly drawn out of necessity, budgets. Also, this is a district or a BOCES that spends a lot of time looking at labor market data, and and they actually saw that and employers were saying, we're afraid we're not going to be able to get enough people that are ready to work on these much more sophisticated vehicles. And so that was how they got started. And I think a lot of their success has to do with the fact that they're really willing to go in and sit down and ask businesses, what is it that you want kids to come out and know and be able to do, and have them at the table when they design the programming. Because sometimes it does sort of work, I think, where schools will say to businesses, hey, give us money and give us support, but don't tell us how we should run programs, which is not always, I think, the best sale, right, for a local business. So it's really interesting. I love the idea of these classrooms being located in this business, and they have some really amazing partnerships with Lockheed Martin, with a heavy road equipment manufacturer. They have some very interesting with a TV and a broadcast television and radio station. So I kind of wish it had been around when I was back in high
And
school.
a lot
to be
of those
perfectly
students have been
honest.
hired on.
And many of the
Yeah.
students have been hired. I mean, and you think of that too, right? Like, if you're an employer and you've got all these kids that are there, and you're seeing them twice a week for a grand total of 5 to 7 hours. I mean, what a great way to get first crack at good hires. You know what I mean? Like, you actually really know what they're like. It's much better than an interview that might last an hour.
Yeah, it was interesting because in Mark's booth, somebody said something about employers hire for attitude and teach aptitude. And I thought that was interesting because your booth was broadly focused on, on what the challenges are for preparing students for the future of work. But a lot of the discussion was on skills. What are the skills that students need for the new workforce? Can you talk a little bit about what people told you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges with this, just to start, is that the future of work is a kind of nebulous concept that has so many different definitions, and I think can be kind of intimidating to people who are being told that they need to think about it in terms of how students are prepared for it. Obviously there are elements of it that relate to the rapid evolution of technology and the advancement of digital tools that are going to sort of reshape the way that workplaces function and the sort of technical abilities students need to have. But a lot of what we discussed in the booth was actually sort of the importance of soft skills. We had a piece in our special report where our colleague Michelle interviewed a bunch of executives from major companies, asking them sort of what kind of class they would design for high school students, to kind of prepare them for working at their companies. And we had a lot of executives who said we need people who have great interpersonal skills, people who have strong emotional intelligence, ability to navigate conflict and to think creatively, think outside the box. And those softer, more abstract skills, I think, are can be difficult to sort of wrap your head around and to sort of translate into curriculum. In the discussion as well, we had people who emphasized that reading and writing shouldn't be counted out of this discussion as well. Mm-hmm. Those are skills that are essential no matter how much else changes in the future. And I think there can be a tendency maybe to sort of focus more on what's changing than on what remains constant and what sort of needs to be there fundamentally. So it was interesting to hear just kind of the different ways that educators are thinking about defining these terms, let alone sort of putting them into practice in their schools.
Mm-hmm. And creativity, of course, is one of those soft skills. It's interesting that one of the things you discussed in your article, as well as in this booth, was that businesses and educators have different ideas about just what creativity is.
Yes, and I was with Megan Fessels of Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce, and she's been studying how creativity is seen across different fields and how it's valued across different fields. And it's really interesting because some fields you might not think about, like physics or math or business, have a really high premium given in terms of income for people who are highly creative. And those are areas that schools might not think of as inherently creative fields. Generally, when teachers are thinking about creativity and when schools are planning programs to improve creativity, they're arts programs. Mm-hmm. And there were several folks talking about the arts and the importance of the arts in our discussion. But there was also a caution of it can get siloed in the arts, and arts can be required to take on all of the responsibility for instilling creativity. And therefore, it doesn't get spread out and it doesn't get considered by kids to be something that is a process of thinking the same way critical thinking or analytical thinking is a process of thinking. And instead, it gets considered to be a trait. Mm-hmm. And there was actually a study that was brought up during the discussion that if even in the arts, if arts isn't specifically including creativity and self-expression as part of the arts curriculum, then it can lead to students feeling that they aren't creative people or being more inclined to think that that is something that they may or may not have as opposed to something that they may or may not learn.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, in a couple of the chat rooms, we heard something about the tension between college versus career. Your guest talked about that, Stephen, mm-hmm. and you talked about that a little bit as well, Mark. Can you relate for us what those discussions were?
Well, certainly in mine, a few of the guests or the people who attended the chat said, I'm totally sold on this, better connection between academics and the workforce. But, my guidance counselors are telling kids take sort of what we would call traditional college prep classes and prepare for SAT and ACT. And of course, those exams are very traditional sorts of gauges of reading and mathematics. And so she felt that, like, on the one hand, kids were being pulled in this direction, even as her district was trying to improve these other connections. And that led us to this very interesting conversation. And I think for a long time, these CTE kinds of programs have suffered from the stigma of being not academically rigorous. Whereas, in fact, we see the trend being in them, in fact, to be much more of providing the academic rigor, but in a different way. You know what I mean? And I do think it takes some logical leaps to figure out if I am teaching a broadcast program, how I work the reading and skills into that and the math skills into that. And that's very much, I think, kind of what you were mentioning also just a few minutes ago. But, Mark said that the one things that employers often weren't so worried about was the really highly technical skills. And so, in fact, the BOCES in New York, the deputy superintendent who was my guest for our room said, they have profiles that list technical skills that, are specific to each of their embedded programs, but they've also noticed that there is a common set of what we might call soft skills. I don't really like that term because I think it sounds kind of pejorative, but basically the idea of work ethic, ability to communicate with others, and that those were almost universal, and that was what businesses really wanted students to come into their programs with, and they were assured they felt that they could do the on the job training sort of on their own. So I thought that was interesting. We've also written at the paper about, for example, literacy in this context. So I think these are questions that school systems really are sort of struggling with. And I don't think that they're easy, but I don't think that they're, it's impossible to, bridge the gap either.
Yeah, and going back to what you said, Debbie, about college versus career, I mean, this is something that I think parents often sort of struggle with
Sure.
as well, in terms of not maybe recognizing that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that preparing a student for college does not mean that there's kind of no room for thinking about careers, and kind of going maybe earlier in their educational experience, sort of not kind of presenting college as kind of the preferable path to take, and sort of career as the secondary tier. I think is probably an important way for kids to feel that they have a variety of options and aren't being sent down kind of one path or another. And so navigating those interactions with parents who maybe have a more kind of set mindset about those things, I think, can be difficult as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're nearing the end of our talk, so I want to take this time to refer you to the special report that spurred this whole conversation today. This is it. It's called The New World of Work, Our Schools Falling Down, Our Schools Falling Behind. I hope
they're not falling down.
No, that's another report.
Yeah, we'll come back to another video.
Right.
on that,
Report.
So please come back and look it up and get some more information from there. And we have enjoyed this opportunity to share some of our reporting with you today.
Debbie, hold it up. Maybe everyone can see it's very bright,
I don't know if you can
attractive
see it.
cover, but there we go. Yeah.